Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The Boston bombing. In custody is the younger brother, Tsarnaev brother. The older brother, now dead, his path these last years, especially January of 2012 to July of 2012, his trip to Dagestan and to Chechnya, much under consideration. Links to groups overseas, jihadist groups. Links to preachers, comments about his radicalization. All of that is under investigation, active review. Setting that aside, we have a report out of Canada tonight that is highly suggestive of Al-Qaeda. Two men, one named Cheheb Essegair and the other Raid Jasser. Do not know their origins. They're Canadian residents. They're not Canadian citizens. Essegair might be Turkish, I'm told. Raid Jasser might be Tunisian, I'm told. We'll fill those details in. In other words, we don't know their origins, but we do know the Canadian authorities tonight, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, are saying they've detained them, have been watching them for up to a year, because they were about to launch an Al-Qaeda plot against a train, perhaps the train bridge crossing the Niagara Falls from Toronto to New York. Launch that plot to either wreck or damage the train and cause a sensation. Not only are they Al-Qaeda linked, according to the Canadian authorities, but they're Iranian Al-Qaeda linked. It's a paradox in front of us. The question of the Boston bombers, however, also links to a policy in Washington with regard to immigration. And that's why I welcome David Drucker of Roll Call, who writes Goppers, and John Funn of the National Review Online. Gentlemen, good evening to you. David, I begin with you because your column over these last days points to concerns of the immigration reform proponents on Capitol Hill, chiefly in the Senate, but also in the House. They're concerned about the Boston bombing. These were legal immigrants. One, the younger brother, now in custody and charged federally with weapons of mass destruction, has an American citizenship. The other, Tamerlan, the deceased brother, had a green card. Why does this worry supporters of reform? Good evening, David.
Good evening, John. And what supporters of the reform effort are worried about is that the opponents of comprehensive immigration reform might have finally found an issue that they can successfully demagogue, or, if you will, use successfully to drum up more public opposition to this legislative effort. It's been interesting, unlike the last effort in 2007, there's been a lot of political momentum for a rewrite of U.S. immigration law. There's been minimal public opposition, and even on Capitol Hill among Republicans, there's been minimal vocal opposition. There's a lot of skepticism, there's a lot of trepidation. There are a lot of Republicans that need to see a bill, need to read it through, need to be assured and reassured, but there's been not too much opposition. In fact, last week, Steve King, the Republican from Iowa, who's notably against any pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrant residents, I asked him, do you think you can drum up the support from the, if necessary, to block this effort? And Robert Costa, National Review, that John writes for, had a nice article about that, and he said, unless public opposition materializes, I think it's going to pass. And so when this came up, it was a fresh talking point and a fresh substantive piece of opposition that the opponents started waving around and using to raise questions about the Senate's Gang of Eight bill. We have not seen yet the House Gang of Eight bill. It's still under construction. And supporters, especially Friday morning before the first hearing in the Senate, were talking amongst themselves, and as I spoke to one of them, admitted, yes, we're concerned.
Mr. Fund, a very good evening to you. The Boston bombers, have they in any way discomfited the administration, especially with regard to the narrative that Al-Qaeda's defeated, it's on the path to defeat, bin Laden's dead, they're scattered, we're just killing their officers with drones? Is the administration considering reviewing that, given the news from Canada within these last hours? Good evening, John.
Well, they will avoid trying to do that publicly for as long as they can. Remember, both because of the expertise of our intelligence agencies and because of the media's, I think, willingness to sweep the Fort Hood incident near Waco under the rug. Remember, this was a jihadist who killed 12 people, but they put it down as workplace violence, even though he shouted Allah Akbar as he made his rounds. I believe this is the first time the administration has had to confront domestic terrorism that they can't wish away or redefine, and it's inconvenient. In addition, even though the perpetrators were caught very quickly, this Canadian thing is very troubling because, remember, Canada has a completely different immigration policy than we do when it comes to deciding who gets to be a citizen.
Much more tolerant, much more welcoming, yes.
Right. And it also, everything about the immigration bill has been the security on the southern border. But as I recall a few years ago, one of the most deadly planned attacks was somebody who was caught coming in from Canada near Seattle. So I think this opens up two questions. One is, how much do we have to worry about our northern border, which is very porous? And two, to what extent, since both the Canadians and us are having these terrorism problems, to what extent are there others out there? And this does provide the opponents of immigration reform a real talking point.
And, David, you have a column up about John Boehner, slow-walking immigration reform in the House. We spoke last week about Pete Roskam, the deputy chief majority whip, talking about slow-walking, lots of hearings, doing pieces of immigration reform in not all at once, but step by step. Does the Boston bombing strengthen Mr. Roskam's argument and Mr. Boehner's argument to go very slowly here?
Well, I think that it argues for taking a look at this situation and seeing how you incorporate it into any reform effort. And I think in some ways you could use it as a reason to pursue a rewrite of U.S. immigration law to try and, fill holes. I think it's important to understand when you talk to Republican leaders about going slow on immigration. Now, normally what that means in Washington is you're afraid to do something, so let's go slow and hope it dies and goes away. But I think we need to look at it in a different light, particularly given the lack of success from rushing big ideas and seeing that they haven't either happened or worked out all that well. If you go slow enough on an issue like this that people can't accuse the proponents of rushing it and trying to hide bad things, I think it might actually be easier to make the case that it's worth voting for and that you don't have to be afraid of it. And I think Republican leaders in the House and Senate, and this is something Marco Rubio understands in the Senate, understand that by saying you're willing to have a full open process, it's a better way to keep the public from freaking out and therefore have Republican votes you need from disappearing. And it's a different way of looking at things in Washington. But look at how the gun bill went last week with Manchin and Toomey. It was rushed, and it didn't go well, and I think there's something to that.
Yes, let's flag that because we're going to move the Affordable Care Act next. Mr. Fund, the failure of the administration on the Manchin-Toomey amendment last week, was the White House surprised by that? Your information, John.
Well, there's an old rule in Washington, which is you never go to the floor unless you know you have the vote.
Correct.
And both Harry Reid and the White House went to the floor, and for whatever reasons Harry Reid had, the White House was stunned.
Stunned. And that means that they either didn't do their homework or they wanted a defeat. Can we pick, John?
No. No president wants a highly embarrassing defeat on an issue that he has spent so much time and political treasure on.
Mr. Drucker, I just want to check with you on this. That was last week in which our heads were swiveling like The Exorcist with all the news in Boston. Did the administration have a hard count when it went to the Manchin-Toomey vote?
So I have to rely here on my colleagues who I trust and what we wrote in roll call. And if they didn't know they didn't have the votes, we certainly knew, and everybody who read us knew. And I think that they went to the floor with the vote anyway, A, hoping they could change minds at the last minute because people maybe would be afraid to vote against it, and B, because they figured, fine, we'll put people on notice, they can vote against this, and we can, hammer them over the head with it. I agree with John, you definitely wanted it to pass if you're the administration, but they had to know, in my opinion, and Reid had to know that they didn't have the votes.
John Fund of the National Review Online and David Drucker of Roll Call. He writes the Gophers column. When we come back, we're going to just speak of the Affordable Care Act. Remember that? It's coming later this year, and there's reason to believe no one's ready. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.